Well, well, well. Here we are, ancient Rome and the rise of Christianity. Let's start at the end. Late 370 CE. We've got a Spanish lady pilgrim, Egeria. Egeria, she is on a pilgrimage to where, you ask? To the Holy Lands. So she's crossing from Spain over into the Sinai Peninsula. She's going to be in parts of Egypt. She's eventually going to get to Jerusalem, where she stays from 381 to 384 on part of her pilgrimage. Her ability to traverse the Mediterranean, as we will see, is a statement of Roman power, Roman control, the ability of Rome to enforce peace in the region. But her participation in Christianity is an advent of the later Roman Empire. I mean, by the 370s, Rome's been cooking for about 1,000 years, although not total dominance in the Mediterranean. That is not quite that long. And Christianity, for most of its existence to this point, to the 370s, 380s, has been outlawed by Rome. It's not until 313 CE that Roman rulers reversed the policy on outlawing Christianity. And in 380, Rome goes as far as to make Christianity the official religion. So this is about the time when Egeria is moving. Rome, it's not just some sort of rebel ideology she's following along. This is by the time she's moving fast on its way to becoming, or has already become, state religion. Egeria is traveling during this change, and she is doing something that many Christian believers in her corner of the world have wanted to do for a long time. She's seeing the places, the journey of the Jews, especially she writes about from important places in Genesis on to the book of Exodus when they make their exodus from Egypt. We've talked about the probably more archaeologically appropriate origins of that story in an earlier lecture. You're welcome to go back to that. I think it's module 2. Let's read what Egeria has to say. Let's read her description of this journey that she's on, and then talk a little bit more about her significance before we get on to the Romulans. All right, so we have Egeria, her diary, which is, diaries as well as letters back, compose this text. It's not left to us completely. We mostly just have a sort of middle portion. Nonetheless, it's extremely interesting, detailed account of one faithful Christian woman's travels from one side of the Roman Empire to another. She writes back in chapter 7, and this is from a 1970 translation. I was, of course, already acquainted with the land of Gessen. Now, the land of Gessen, if you're guessing where it might be, it's sort of in your mind's eyes Google map, the northeast of Egypt, a section that in Genesis is purportedly given to the Jews by the Egyptian pharaoh. So she's acquainted with the land of Gessen from the time when I first went to Egypt. It was, however, my purpose to see all the places which the children of Israel had touched on their journey, from their going forth from Ramses until they reached the Red Sea at a place which is now called Clysma. So the Red Sea is right here, and Clysma is right here, because of the fortress which stands there. It was therefore our wish to go from Clysma to the land of Gessen, specifically to the city which is called Arabia. This city is in the land of Gessen, and this territory takes its name from it. That is, the land of Arabia is the land of Gessen. She continues, though this land is a part of Egypt, it is nevertheless far better than the rest of Egypt. It is a 4-day journey across the Red Sea to the city of Arabia. Though the journey is across the desert, each resting station has a military outpost with soldiers and officers who always guided us from fortress to fortress. The holy men who were with us on this journey, the priests and monks that is, showed us all the places which I was always seeking out, following the scriptures. Some of the places were to the left of our route, some of them were to the right. Some were far off the road, some were up close. I hope your charity will believe me that, as far as I was able to see, the children of Israel marched along in this manner, going a certain distance to the right, then going an equal distance to the left, going ahead a certain distance, then backtracking an equal distance, and they marched along this way until they reached the Red Sea. There's more to digest here with Egeria's story than it might seem. Who was she? What is she doing? Well, she's writing these letters, this diary, back home to Christian women, but this is a strange, at least from a modern perspective, strange time in Christianity's geography, because she's writing back to Christian women, but these Christian women would not have been nuns, and indeed could not have been nuns back in Spain. The first nunneries in Christianity weren't founded anywhere in what we traditionally think of as Europe. They were founded in Egypt in the 300s. She, as is obvious from the text, she wanted to see the Bible lands, the lands of the Old Testament. She would have been well educated in Christian texts. Her ability to travel lets us know that she would have been incredibly wealthy, but without taking away any cred to her ability to travel, the wealth, the tenacity it would take to make this journey. It's also worth pointing out all of the military posts that she mentions. Travel in her time was extremely common for those who could afford it and fairly safe. This is part of the Roman Empire. Those fortresses between which they are moving are Roman-run fortresses. So the empire itself is enabling her naval journey across the Mediterranean Sea, and it is enabling her to safely travel from point A to point B. It sounds like a very circuitous journey that she thinks the peoples of the Old Testament, the first 5 books or so, took. But she's making that journey, and she's making it under Roman protection with guides from local Christian priests or monks in Egypt, which I'll say one more time, is the place where we first get nunneries, our first major organized Christian institutions. That is not to say, however, before we move forward, that it's fully Egyptian. When we left off talking about Alexander the Great, we had Ptolemy ruling over Egypt, and yet he himself was ethnically Greek. Greek was sort of the top of the totem pole in Egyptian society at that time, and what we might think of as native or local Egyptian was very much at the bottom. And what we've done now is we've replaced that sort of Greek culture at the top with Roman rule. So the people starting churches in Egypt are not Egyptian in the way that someone today from Egypt is Egyptian. They are culturally far more related to the Roman center than they are to where they're actually living in North Africa. Nonetheless, this is a good way to start our look at Rome. It's an interesting place, a long-lived empire. The Roman Republic itself is first founded in 509 BCE. After several centuries of stable rule, it enters a period of political chaos that it emerges from in 27 BCE, not as a republic, but as a monarchy. By 138 BCE, so a little bit before, Rome had conquered the entire Mediterranean region, not a small feat. By 330 CE, however, the wolves are at the gates. Those wolves are Western European, and so Rome moves the gates. It switches the capital from Rome in Italy to Constantinople, moving the capital to what had become a more economically and politically important region of the empire anyway, but also it's important to note, to avoid enemies that Rome could no longer handle. So we'll start with Rome as a city-state, and much of what we know about the very earliest history of Rome comes from a Greek historian named Polybius, who was sent to Rome as a hostage and left behind the rise of the Roman Empire, a history much in the vein of Herodotus, who we looked at in the earlier lecture. Now, Rome begins expanding militarily with a policy of creating allies out of its defeated enemies. By 272 BCE, Rome had conquered the entire Italian peninsula. By 202 BCE, they had defeated Carthage in North Africa and dominated the western Mediterranean region. By 146 BCE, they took Carthage again from the Greeks. By 133 BCE, they had defeated Alexander's successors where they lay and controlled the entire Mediterranean region. Now, the geography here you should hopefully know. The city of Rome, I don't think it's a surprise, lies in the middle of the Italian peninsula, and it's sort of protected on some sides by the Apennines, a series of mountains that runs north to south. The Alps, of course, run across the top of Italy in the north. The early Roman peoples farming where the city is now would have enjoyed volcanic soil, far more fertile than the soil farmed by our Greeks, who we looked at last time. And west of Italy, there are certain large islands that served as kind of stepping stones for the Romans on their way to North Africa, Sardinia, Corsica, and then to the south, we have Sicily, a clear stepping stone to Tunisia, which is only from Sicily 100 miles away by sea, and that's no distance at all in this period of human history. Now, the story goes, and we won't spend too much time here, that the city of Rome was founded by two twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, grandsons of the rightful king. An evil king seized power and ordered the death of these twins. The servant ordered to kill them, however, did not do so, and instead abandoned them on their own. Romulus and Remus, raised by wolves. Romulus himself goes on to found the earliest versions of the city-state of Rome in 753 BCE. So the story goes, but we have 1,000 years to cover, so we can't do the whole story. Romans learned city planning, they learned sewage management and wall construction, all from their neighbors to the north. They adopted their alphabet from neighbors to the north as well, which was originally Greek, in about 600 BCE, although the Romans themselves would have spoken Latin. Those neighbors to the north would have been the Etruscans, the former power in the region who adopted much of their writing system from the Greeks. So Roman and the Latin writing system, of course, have this long tradition starting with the Phoenicians, through the Greeks, through the Etruscans, and into Rome. The earliest form of government in our sort of expanding on the peninsula early stages of Rome was a monarchy. So there's monarchy, republic, and then back to monarchy around 27 BCE. In these earlier periods, kings would have governed in consultation with what are called patricians, an assembly of men from Rome's most prominent, richest families. These people would have been distinct from commoners or plebeians, and the assembly would have chosen the successor to the king, so it's not an entirely hereditary position. The Republic is founded in 509 BCE, where people choose their own officials to govern over them. These officials selected two executives called consuls, who actually did the sort of highest elements of ruling. Consuls would have been elected to 1-year terms, and these consuls consulted with the Roman Senate, made entirely out of patricians, and somewhat less often consulted with a plebeian assembly, so here are our commoners joining government, in which all citizens could vote. After 400 BCE, the Romans start encountering threats from people that are going to remain threats, at least especially to the western portion of the empire, for much of its history, and indeed eventually bring it down. Rome had to start fighting off mountain peoples to its north and to its west. These are the Celts and the Gauls coming in from the Alps. In 387 BCE, Rome even lost battles to the Gauls, wherein the city was itself sacked and looted, but the Gauls did not stay. The Gauls destroyed the city, took what they wanted, and left. In the 300s, Rome began to expand, taking other city-states. If people spoke Latin within this expanding system, then the Roman rulers would allow them to join the system of government and become a citizen. If you did not speak Latin, you had to pay taxes and you had to become a soldier, and you had no political rights. Rome focused quite famously on building roads. These roads mostly went between Rome and the new city-states, which they ran. You need to collect taxes efficiently. You need to move military efficiently. It was incredibly successful. They control all of Italy by 321 BCE, except for the south, which remains at this point heavily Greek. It took another 50 years for them to take full control of the peninsula from the Greeks, but eventually they do. We moved quite quickly, but we need not dwell where the ancient origins and myths of Rome. We need to get to the world historical Rome. Let's do it. In 272 BCE, while Rome controls all of what is now Italy, there are in total 6 powers around the Mediterranean, and they, between the 6 of them, do not share any kind of cultural identity, although some of them share identities together. In the east, there are the 3 successors of Alexander. There's the Antigonids in Macedon, the Lucids in Syria, and the Ptolemies in what is Egypt. Greece, all of its city-states are controlled essentially by 2 different leagues. And in Carthage, you have a group of people controlling the North African coast and southern portions of Spain, as well as half of Sicily. This is where the war starts. This is where Rome begins to expand beyond the Italian peninsula, beyond pushing Greek power off that peninsula, and out onto other continents. In 264 BCE, Rome and Carthage, which again is North Africa, go to war. The war starts over who will control the island of Sicily. Rome itself sent troops to support a city-state on that island which was actively fighting a war against Carthage powers. This is the first of the Punic Wars. Citizen soldiers, Romans, versus professional mercenaries from Carthage. The wars went on for 20 years before Rome finally controlled all of the island of Sicily. In the Second Punic Wars, 218 to 202 BCE, we saw 2 generals from each side opposing each other. There's Scipio Africanus in Rome against Hannibal from Carthage, both pictured here. Now, Polybius, our Greek historian forced to go as hostage to Rome, argued that the causes of the Second War came not from any grand political endeavors, no dream of a world-spanning empire, but from Hannibal's father's loss in the First War. So Hannibal goes to war because he wants to avenge his father. In going to this war, Hannibal led an infantry of 50,000 soldiers, multiple cavalry units, and a collection of 37 elephants on a 9-month march across southern France. Remember, Carthage power extends into southern Spain. So he's going through southern France, through the Alps, off to fight Rome by heading down from the north. Polybius thought that this was a wild idea, and he was probably right. Many of Hannibal's men froze or starved to death in crossing the Alps, and elephants, famously not cold weather mountain animals, all of them except one, 36 elephants of the 37, died during the journey. Polybius made it through the Alps with only half of his original army still intact. And this army is fairly diverse. It represents the territory controlled by Carthage. It included peoples from what's about to be called Africa, people from Spain, Celts, Phoenicians, Italians, and Greeks. And this diversity intimidated the Romans. Polybius credited Roman victory in even this Second Punic War, however, with organizational policies. Now, it wasn't a complete wash for Hannibal. Now, it wasn't a complete wash for Hannibal and his armies. His army won several major battles in Italy before Rome defeated Carthage in a battle at Zama in North Africa in 202 BCE. Roman soldiers continued east to defeat the Alexandrian successors, those people we talked about, the Ptolemies, the Seleucids, the Antigonids, and so on. Carthage rose against Rome one last time in 146 BCE. After Roman victory, the city this time was ordered completely
destroyed, and all survivors were sent to Rome as slaves. So let's think about this. They go to war 3 times. Once over Sicily. Once because Hannibal's forces, at least according to Polybius, want revenge for losing that battle over Sicily. That's our first 2 Punic wars. And then finally, a 3rd time that ends in 146 BCE when Rome enacts probably its single most bloodthirsty, most brutal policy at all. The Senate forbade rebuilding Carthage. They destroyed it completely to the ground and took every survivor they could and sold them into slavery. Instead of rebuilding it, they created a new province across the north of this continent to the south of them on the other side of the Mediterranean, and they named it after one of their generals, one of their very famous generals involved in these Punic Wars. They named it Africa. The new governor of this province of Africa was in charge of about 5,000 square miles of territory that included parts of what is now Libya, Tunisia, and Algeria. He would have had an incredibly low staff, not very many people working for him, which meant that he had to leave previous governmental structures in place. The biggest challenge is the same thing that's always the biggest challenge: collecting taxes. To collect these taxes on such a slim staff working with previously existing government structures, the governor of the Roman province of Africa had to turn to what are called tax farmers. These are people who collected tax for a fee. So they would turn in the tax they agreed to collect, but they would take more actual grain, money, whatever the form of the tax is, from the people they were taxing than was actually called for, thereby paying themselves. These were called equites, these tax farmers, because they descended from soldiers who were initially on horseback. It's best if we want to understand sort of person-to-person social organization in Rome that we understand each family, each powerful family, as a very large sort of social organization looking out for itself. Let me give you an example. In 168 BCE, let's stick with the small cast of characters we have here. The family of Scipio Africanus, our general for whom the province of Africa was named, they convinced local authorities to allow Polybius, our historian, to stay with them. And while he's staying with them, Polybius becomes very good friends with Scipio Africanus's grandson, Scipio Aemilianus. And Polybius, who's become powerful in his own right within the empire, offers to help Scipio Aemilianus develop a career in politics. To do that, Scipio has to become part of Polybius's family, swear an oath of loyalty to him, and then Polybius, on his end, is responsible for taking care of Scipio. This is a patron-client relationship that was extremely common in Rome among powerful families, and a way of building your familial network out larger than it otherwise would be by including people to whom you're not technically blood related in that family. So Scipio here would have been playing the role of client. He was dependent on the family of Polybius, again, not his actual family. These clients, they were often people coming into new cities looking for connections. They could be traders, merchants moving around the empire, or they could be people looking for new, powerful familial connections to, in Scipio's case, make a career in politics. Now, on the other side of this obligation to defend, to protect, to be loyal to the family, patrons, the people who take on these clients, had obligations to support their clients both financially and legally, while these clients are still busy being loyal to their new families. The head of this network of sort of born into the family, married into the family, and adopted as adult into the family through this patron-client relationship, the head of this whole network was called the pater familias. This is the legal head of an extended family in Rome who made all decisions and was the only person within this family who could own property. So if you're part of this family, any property you have belongs to the paterfamilias, not to you. These really do, I must emphasize, operate a little bit like sort of economic political organizations, and you can decide when the paterfamilias dies, the sons who outlive him, they can decide for themselves, is this thing we've created, this new organization, strong enough that it's worth it to nominate only one of us to be the new paterfamilias, or do we want to split it up and run our own separate families, and each of us surviving sons, become new paterfamilias over a smaller network? These are not, however, the only forms of kind of social relations and contracts. There's also marriage to be considered in ancient Rome. And here there are essentially two forms. So among the powerful people in the Roman Empire, marriage was a formal contract saying that the father would recognize the children of this marriage as his heirs, the father or the husband. More often, however, men and women moved in together and were simply sort of recognized as married. So if you're common, it's not so much a legal affair as a cohabitation situation. Women in this system are allowed to inherit, own, and pass down property, but only under the stewardship of a male guardian. And we must remember, if they're part of a paterfamilias network, that property that they're moving around at base really isn't theirs at any point. Men and women could also both initiate divorce, which is not so bad given the time period. The role of women in these families was, more than anything, especially among the elite, to work hard to educate their children, make sure they were able to read, make sure they had a good social background, a good upbringing so they could have a good career and participate in the lives of other powerful people, and to arrange marriages to build that family network as best they could. So women really are operating here as absolutely essential, both teachers and diplomats between different powerful families. There is, as was mentioned with Carthage, another layer to this. So we have our paterfamilias, that whole network. Powerful people care about their marriages being legal contracts. Commoners do not care about that kind of thing. It's basically a social cohabitation situation. Women, especially among the powerful, are diplomats and teachers. And then under all of that, the lowest rung of society, we have enslaved people. These are usually peoples captured in battle. And they, like in every slavery situation, forms of labor vary based on the skill set of the enslaved person. We had both field and house jobs. House jobs, of course, here are better than field jobs, easier work, better conditions. The worst thing you could be in terms of a slave in the Roman Empire was a mining slave. These are the worst and most deadliest, most likely to harm you jobs. The life expectancy of a slave working in a mine in the Roman Empire is not very long at all. Now, there is slavery, but an enslaved person in this system, it's potentially possible for them to gain their freedom, and it is potentially possible for them to become full citizens. Despite that potentiality, however, children of enslaved mothers, no matter who their father was, free or enslaved person, the children of an enslaved mother was born into slavery. So slavery within this system is hereditary, and enslaved peoples are not a small amount of this population. The slave population during the Republic was something like 25%, which is enormously high by world historical standards. What we need to talk about when we talk about the late Republic, in comparing it to other empires that we'll talk about in this series of lectures, is the way in which it gives way to a kind of figure, a term for which I will borrow from Chinese history, a warlord. So let's tell the story of the fracturing of power, the decentralization of the power of the Republic, And keep in mind that this dynamic that's emerging here with the emergence of warlords or locally powerful military figures, that's a dynamic that every empire faces given certain conditions, and can be and has been the downfall of many, many empires. So in the Roman context, the emergence of these warlords is rooted not only, but partly in the expansion of the empire itself. So Rome is growing. Rome is taking ever more territory, and it has to, because there is ever more territory to control, it has to call on its citizen soldiers to help control that territory. In the earliest years of the Republic, most people weren't out fighting most of the time. These were soldiers who were living on farms and going to the front sometime if something threatened Rome. By the time Rome is in control of the province of Africa and things like this, the front that needs to be defended is absolutely massive. So our soldiers, who were landowning citizens, find themselves in a situation where their main source of income is their salary as a soldier. There is no need to maintain that farmland they have back home. So they start selling it off to wealthier families who can afford it. And of course, these wealthier families, through gaining more farmland, gain more wealth. They use that increased wealth to buy more farmland. Eventually, you get a cycle where there's an enormous amount of professional soldiers, and there are a few very wealthy families who own an enormous portion of the land within the empire and have bought it from people who were in dire straits for one reason or another, which means those people who sold their land, if they aren't soldiers on the front, are now landless. They are turning to the capital. They're looking for work. If not begging, they might be turning to banditry, stealing, and things like that. And as they move, these rich people, these wealthy families who are buying up all these lands and turning these lands into what are called latifundia, essentially plantations, are realizing that it's much cheaper for them to purchase an enslaved person than it is to keep peoples on who might have otherwise been hired farmhands. So we're getting plantations with a lot of slave labor, we're getting a disgruntled, dislocated population, and a concentration of wealth in the form of land among just a few people. This is not a good recipe, but it could be something that Rome might avoid. They don't, but it could be something they could avoid. A reformer by the name of Tiberius Gracchus enters this scene as sort of an early effort to do something about the sort of massive wealth disparity that's emerging within the empire. Bear in mind, we've got all these landless people now flooding into the capital. And so Tiberius Gracchus, he says, look, if we're constantly expanding, if we have these soldiers, which are now just a full-time professional army at the front, why don't we take the land that we are conquering out there at the front and give it to these landless people? Move our poor from the imperial center to the imperial edge, give them the land and let them farm it. Now that seems reasonable to me, but I was not alive back then. The problem was that the existing arrangement actually granted that land at the front to our wealthy families who own enormous amounts of land at the center already. So there's an enormous amount of pushback against Tiberius Gracchus's reforms, and eventually he's killed for that idea. His younger brother Gaius Gracchus comes in and proposes even broader reforms and is killed in mob fighting between these reformers and their opponents. This situation of extreme wealth inequality and increasing political violence just increases across the 1st century BCE in Rome, until a general emerges named Marius, or maybe Marius, who has a volunteer army behind him made out of the city's poor, and he is the first significant warlord. And let me be clear, I am using the word warlord. I've gotten it from a Chinese context. Please don't turn to Roman history expecting to see this word everywhere. I think it helps to use it in to describe problems in many different imperial contexts. What is a warlord? A warlord in the Chinese as well as this context and many other contexts, within an imperial governing structure, is a locally powerful person, a wealthy person for whatever reason, who has developed a private military loyal to them, essentially a mercenary military, and who begin slowly to either influence their power over the center using this mercenary military, or claim to govern their local region quasi-independently or fully independently on the back of that military privately loyal to them. That is a warlord. That is because power is being questioned at the center and brought out to wherever that local person is. That is a spiral of decentralization, and it is something that takes down many empires. It is something to watch out for when you're talking about empire as a system of governance in general. So under Marius, these troops are paid for as a portion of their spoils in any victories that they may come through via battle. So again, it's sort of a commission system. Marius is saying, I will lead you, we will go into battle, you keep what you win, that is how you are paid. There's an incentive to fight there, and of course they're not paid by the center. They're not paid by the Roman government itself, so their loyalties are not to the Roman government. Their loyalties, these poor people, landless, pushed into the Roman capital, they are paid through victories orchestrated by Marius. Their loyalty is to Marius. This is a warlord. More private armies on this model quickly begin to develop. So Marius has definitely started a trend of a descent in the 1st century BCE in Rome into warlordism. After Marius dies, another warlord comes in his place named Sulla. And Sulla comes to power exactly the same way through his own private army, loyal to him and not to the political center. In 81 BCE, Lulla had the Senate go so far as to name him dictator. Now, this was not totally unprecedented. The Roman Senate already had a designation and legal structures in place to name someone dictator in times of crisis. However, you were only supposed to be dictator for about 6 months, after which that designation was due to end. Sulla made this permanent. Renew, renew, renew. He, however, dies in 78 BCE, and Rome kind of collapses into this situation where the Senate is still running, but there are many warlord generals within this system all vying for power. And it's these warlord generals with their different spheres of influence that are actually at this point controlling the Senate, despite the fact that the Senate is continuing to meet and continuing to elect consuls, and the sort of facade of normal republican governance is still going on. Now, these large private armies, you might be asking yourself, what are they conquering if everything is happening in the center? They're not in the center. Many of them are out on the front. Many of them are expanding the territory of the Roman Empire. So these large private armies are conquering new territory for Rome in the 1st century BCE, funding themselves and keeping their warlord heads powerful. For example, the Seleucids in Syria are conquered in 64 BCE by what is effectively warlord armies out of Rome. The most successful commander in this situation is, of course, my God, a man you've heard of before, Julius Caesar, who's famous for conquering Gaul. This is an extraordinarily prosperous region encompassing northern Italy and what is now France. After being governor of Gaul for a term, Caesar leads his armies into Rome in 49 BCE, and he demands something that is already precedent, started by Sulla. He demands to be named dictator, and he holds that title for about 5 years, until 44 BCE, when he demands to be named, or rather he names himself, dictator for life. So not much has changed in the real politics going on, but something very significant has changed in the sort of formal designations. He's not being continually named dictator over a period of crisis. He is now on paper dictator for life, and he's the first in this period to do that, and this is a major problem. Opposition to this eventually costs Caesar his life. He was assassinated for this move, and Rome fell into a protracted period of civil war. It's Caesar's heir, a man named Octavian, a great nephew of Caesar, and so Caesar would have been his pater familias and things like this. Octavian will take the throne and become Augustus. It's Octavian who, in 30 BCE, conquers the Ptolemies and makes Egypt a province of the empire. Octavian is going to come in with some resolution to this situation, but it's not going to be very democratic. Okay, so what is that resolution? Well, Octavian comes in, he takes power in 27 BCE. And when he comes into power, remember, he's 3 years after bringing Egypt into the Roman Empire. When he sits on the throne, he controls the entire Mediterranean. And he's a smart operator. Not someone we might want to laud for their human principles, but a smart guy. He never calls himself emperor. You know, Julius Caesar got killed for calling himself dictator for life. So Octavian's not going to do something like that. He's far more intelligent. Instead, what he does is he calls himself a princeps, which just means first citizen. So, I'm just a citizen like any of you citizens. I'm just the first one, the top one. And he devised a period of Roman history called the Roman principate. The system of government in Rome, this principate, operated from 27 BCE to 284 CE. So what he changes is very, very long-lived. And it's a system in which the princeps ruled the empire as a monarch in all but name. So he institutes the monarchical period of Rome once more. Monarchical in its very, very early days, monarchical beginning again in 27 BCE. Much of this time, from 27 BCE to 180 CE, we get what is called the Pax Romana, or the Roman peace, because of the stability in this region caused by an overwhelming power. And here we need to pause to think about something that's not fun to think about if you are a bleeding heart lefty like myself. This Pax Romana, the idea that peacetime comes not when everyone has equal power, but when there is an overwhelmingly dominant single power. This is a dynamic that occurs in much of East Asian history as well. So there's a fantastic world historian, Giovanni Arrighi, who's passed the last decade or so. But he's got a great text called Adam Smith in Beijing, where he goes over exactly this issue in East Asia. And he says, look, and this is Arrighi talking about East Asia. He says, look, if we think about, say, the 100 Years' Peace in Europe, the 100 years is a blip on a map in European history. Modern European history is ravaged by war, not because there is one great imperial power over all of it, but because they have this Westphalian system of sovereign states that are at least all formally equal, but they wind up being constantly at war with each other because no one state is ever powerful enough to dominate the others to keep them from, 2 or 3 states ganging up on one to go to war. It's not until British power becomes so undisputed that you get the 100 Years' Peace, and we should say that peace is in Europe alone. They're ripping up black and brown people throughout the rest of the world during the 100 Years' Peace. It's only peace for Europe. But Arrighi then he takes that same way of thinking, and he says, well, look at East Asia. With certain caveats, in East Asia, during about the same, roughly a period that encompasses the 100 Years' Peace, we can speak of a 3, and if you want to make a couple of exceptions, a 500 Years' Peace in East Asia. And it's not because it's a system of equals where everyone agrees that, we all see the value of each other's lives and the value of each other's sovereignty, and so we won't go to war. It happens because China is so indisputably powerful that no one would dream of it, except, of course, for the Great East Asian War, where Japan tries to take over Korea, or China by way of Korea, and dreams of even moving past that. But you can look that up on your own. It's outside the history of this course. Anyway, Arrighi wants to tell us that, look, there's only These periods of protracted international peace are, very unfortunately, even Arrighi says, periods where there's an imperial power so large that it can't be questioned. And then you get, some fractious fighting around the corners of that empire, but the center remains at peace because it's not possible to go to war with them. We stop with this aside because it's that way of thinking, that logic is significant for thinking about world history in general, but because it's very easy then also just to add the kind of Roman power that Octavian instigates into this system. So after 27 BCE, you get the Pax Romana until 180 CE, and it's the exact same thing. No one's going to war because no one can afford to survive a war with Rome. Just like the 100 Years' Peace in Europe, no one can afford to survive a war with Britain. Just like the 3 or 5, however you want to take it, years' peace in East Asia, no one can survive a war with China. So take that as you want. It doesn't feel good for me to say it, but I'd be a bad historian if I did not report that that's the case. All right, anyway, back to Rome with a slightly narrower focus. What is Octavian up to? Well, his goal is to establish a regime that will outlive him, and he does. In 27 BCE, the Senate gives him the title of Augustus, which simply means revered. And he goes about setting into place some reforms that do a lot to re-centralize power back onto the political center, back into Rome, and back on top of what is now the princeps, which you should just understand as a new monarchy with a different name. He transfers the ability to tax and to control armies from the Senate to himself. So what he's doing there is he's wiping out the possibility of warlords. He's bringing in all these different fighting factions, and he's starting to attack their power base by making the claim that I am the only person to collect taxes. Therefore, I control all of the state revenue, and I am the only person who is allowed to control a military. This, if nothing else, makes lasting warlords outlaws and gives a pretext for the existing Roman military, funded now by a restabilized tax base, because he's saying we will take all the taxes, thank you very much, no one else can. 2, if there are remaining warlords, simply hunt them down and kill them, because what they're doing is illegal. He also recognizes that Rome's army, due in no small part to its constant expansion, has gotten dangerously large. We can't, A, fund these people all the time, they're just sitting on our payroll, and B, if we can't fund them, they're going to get disgruntled, they're going to revolt if we can't take care of them. So what he does is he demobilizes a significant portion of his military, but he demobilizes them in a very smart way. Again, seeking to build a regime that will outlive him, he donates his own funds to buy these demobilized soldiers land. So he's saying, look, you're not a soldier anymore, but guess what? Not only do you not have to fight and risk your life, you also are not going to go poor, because here is some land you can support yourself. I'll be back later for the taxes I want to extract from that land. So he's extending his tax base as he demobilizes these soldiers, giving them a livelihood, taking away the likelihood that they would rebel against him. It sounds smart to me, and it worked. He takes for himself the right to appoint all military leaders, so suddenly his military leaders are vetted by him. He has a lot of control there, and he also does the same with governors of the provinces. So these governors of the provinces, they don't have the right to collect tax. That's the monarch or princeps. They don't have a right to control a military, and even if they did, they are personally selected by Octavian, now titled Augustus, so they are loyal to him. This eventually creates an incredibly stable system and re-centralizes Roman power. He never, however, resolved the issue of succession to the throne of princeps, or again, just monarch. He never had any sons of his own. He did marry a woman who had a son from a previous marriage that became his heir, but it sort of almost an accident of history. He's the first of many who rule Rome without a clear heir, which means the heir needs to be selected, which means that the Senate when these princeps die, can actually take the time to figure out, of course, there's corruption and things like that, but more than you might think, take time to figure out who is best able to lead. From 98 to 161, the princeps ruling there, none of them had any sons, which means each time one of them died, the Senate had an opportunity to select who is best able to rule. No empire, however, is eternal, and Rome's starts to fall apart. Between 211 and 284, a significant number of the 36 princeps, rulers of Rome, are assassinated, executed, murdered. So political violence at the top does eventually creep its way back into this system. But if you consider the fact that building the system started in 27 BCE, it's a success. So let's talk about the sort of changes to the social ladder that are going on during this history we've just kind of run through. Beginning with the initial conquering of Sicily, when Rome gets its first real proper province, the capital denied men in the province the right to full citizenship. They, of course, denied women as well, but women in the Roman Empire denied citizenship everywhere, so that's no change. If you weren't a citizen in the province, that means you had no access to courts, and that means you had no political participation. So as Rome grows, it's picking up these provinces where no one has any say in how they are governed. Augustus, or Octavian, comes in, and what he's doing is starting to change the number of citizens. Those soldiers that he demobilized and gave land to and then started taxing, brilliant move, he also makes them citizens, granting them that status. So he gives them another buy-in to the system, just another reason why they probably won't, and ultimately don't, revolt. By Augustus's death in 14 CE, there were a total of 4 million Roman citizens. Now, bear in mind, that's not enslaved people, that's not people outside in the provinces who don't qualify, that's not women, just 4 million male Roman citizens. By 212 CE, citizenship was finally granted to all free men in the empire. So enslaved people, still not citizens. Otherwise, they might vote against being enslaved. But free men, all of them now, every single one of them, citizens. We have during this period also some interesting changes, a sort of flattening of the social class structure in Rome. When we opened during the Republican period, we had patricians, we had our equites, we had our plebeians. These are slowly morphing into 2 instead of 3 groups. We have an elite group called the inestiores, and we have a commoner group called the humiliores. Differences there are what you would think. The inestiores are richer, they have better access to power, courts treat them differently, these elites, they treat them with more favor than they do the humiliores. And, inestiores, for example, they can appeal decisions in Roman courts where humiliores cannot. And, when found guilty, inestiores face far less harsh punishment than humiliores. But so it goes from about 3 to about 2 major social classes, of course, enslaved people on the bottom all the time. The place of women also changes. Now, during this period, the age of the paterfamilias has passed. Families are getting far smaller during the principate era. Mostly it's parents plus kids plus a few enslaved people that they bought. Women remain, even after marriage in this new world, part of their father's family, and they could even, when their husbands died, they could reclaim the dowries that had been paid when they got married, which would have been about 1 year of their father's income. Nonetheless, we've got smaller families, women a little bit more influential in the home, women more able to independently own property and things like that. Men, nonetheless, have more power in these relationships as well as in broader society. Marriage continues mostly, especially among the elite, a way of building networks, but the way those networks operate is not as formalized, not as organized as it was under the paterfamilias. So as the title of the lecture promises, as does starting with Egeria and her diary, we also have to talk about the rise of Christianity, an event of world historical significance, of course, during and within the Roman Empire. In the later centuries of the Roman Empire, people were using roads and maritime travel to spread various types of religious beliefs, not just the one to which we are about to turn. Christianity began in the province of Judea, so a Roman province, with a small group of Jewish people who began to spread their views throughout the rest of the Mediterranean, following these trade routes that we saw Egeria describe some hundreds of years after the fact. These routes that are protected by Roman authority under the Pax Romana. Now, a ruler we'll talk about shortly, Constantine, his decision to support Christianity in 313 was a crucial step in extending this belief system throughout the empire, making it not just one of many options, but by the end of the Roman Empire, the official option, the only one. In the Republic and during the Principate, the state had encouraged the worship of many gods within the Roman religion. So most Romans worshipped Jupiter, who was the most powerful, or they might have worshipped Mars, a god of war. Many borrowed this pantheon here. Many of its gods were borrowed from Greek gods and added on to give it some local flair and things like that. Most common people fulfilled public obligations to worship a state-sponsored god, a Jupiter or a Mars, and then what they would do is they would privately return home and worship any number of mysterious cult-like gods that focused on the things that were important to them, their harvest, fertility, and, this is a time where people are also very interested in personal searches for immortality, so they're pursuing that in their private lives, or they're thinking about other types of gods that give them a more close and personal, direct relationship with the divine. And of course, what we've got to do now is talk about one of those options. So the Jews were among the only people in the Roman Empire who remained monotheistic. They have their single god. They never create any images of it. They don't have idols and things like that. They refused to worship Roman gods. The Roman government tolerated this. It wasn't something over which they felt they should make too much of a fuss as long as the tax is paid. And even when the Romans take over Judea and bring it into the empire, the Temple of Jerusalem, which houses Jewish scriptures, it survives the conquest. So 63 BCE, Rome comes in and brings Judea into the empire, but they don't topple the temple. Not yet. Significantly, Jewish beliefs at the time, the things swirling around intellectual life in Judea, included the belief in a Messiah thought to be a teacher of righteousness, who is going to bring salvation. And during this period, there's an enormous amount of disagreement on exactly what that person will be. Teacher of righteousness makes it sound like prophet, but maybe not necessarily. Could be military leader, could be political leader, could be many things. It was open for debate. Almost every surviving record of early Christianity before 100 CE is written by a Christian believer. This is going to create all of the problems that every other world religion has when thinking about where does it come from. First of all, it's blasphemous to ask where does it come from, because that assumes that the God at the head of that religion has not always been and wasn't the creator and things like that. And even with Buddhism, where there isn't a particular God that the Buddha is talking about, he sees himself as just one Buddha among, the most recent Buddha among many. Even there, it's written by the believers, so you've got the sort of fact versus fiction problem, myth versus reality issue. That's baked into all of this early Christian history as well. The earliest account of Jesus' life are, you might guess, the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These would have been written between 70 and 110 CE. And the Gospels tell us that Jesus was born in a place called Bethlehem around 4 BCE to a comparatively wealthy Jewish family near the Sea of Galilee, which itself would have been predominantly a fishing community. There's not much on his life at all before 26 CE, when his cousin, Jesus' cousin, John the Baptist, according to the story, baptizes Jesus in the river Jordan. Now, John himself was a prophet, and he had been going around even before Jesus started his preaching work, urging people to become baptized to prepare for their entrance into the kingdom of God. According to these early texts, between 28 and 29 CE is when Jesus really gets that preaching work done in Galilee. He, like his cousin, urged baptism and repentance, preparing for death, preparing for the return of God, and things like that. In this world, to understand the importance of Jesus as a healer, one has to understand that it's commonly understood in this world that sickness is a presence, a sign of Satan. If you are ill, it is because there is some demon, some element of Satan or his minions has gotten into your body in some way. So healing is not just benevolent. And so when Jesus in the Gospels goes around healing people, it's not just that he's doing some good work. What he's doing is demonstrating in these healing miracles a power over Satan, a power over whatever the forces, however you want to picture the forces of hell. So it's a little bit more grand than just making someone's fever go away or allowing someone to walk again or something like that. Probably his most famous sermon is Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, a sermon in which he lays out a philosophy that significantly privileges the poor and oppressed over the wealthy, over the established. And so in some ways, it has much to do, and this is very, very broad, much to do with the emergence of other world religions, where we see a slow turn among many world religions to, for example, Buddhism through meditation is all about internally controlling your fate and things like that. All you can control is yourself. You don't need an elite class to help you and this sort of thing. Although they're not related, I make no claim that they're related. You do see Christianity making a kind of similar turn, where there's no elite class you have to pay to perform rites or something like that. Your salvation is within your own control, that kind of thing. And we add to it then this religion that's emerging on the corners of at the time, the world's most powerful empire. So there's a lauding of the poor and the oppressed over an elite class. But let's look very quickly at the Sermon on the Mount. So in the Sermon on the Mount, and you will have seen this before probably, we get Jesus saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." So I think this perspective makes some sense. Recall that centuries before, the Hebrew people had developed their own monotheistic religion through reflection on historical defeat, the Babylonian captivity, being freed by Cyrus, and these sorts of things. So if that's their initial turn to monotheism, and that religion continues with that kind of line of thinking, it's not at all weird, here facing the Roman Empire and its expansion, that a prophet would emerge, or an idea system would take hold that continues to say, blessed are the poor, blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are the meek, because that who is there, in many ways, the poor, the peacemakers, and the meek. And Jesus is very clear to make the practice of this religion, in some senses, a very private thing, especially as regards good works. He says, for example, "Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others, to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward for your Father in heaven." This, of course, is a message that came from Confucius, talking about you need to practice the rites in the correct way internally for yourself, for any of them to matter. This is a message that the Buddha had, saying, anyone can know the right chants, anyone can meditate in the right way and still not get it if they're not doing it for the right reasons. So here we get that internality coming out of what Jesus has to say. He says, "So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets, to be honored by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you." Of course, what this idea system has to say about the poor and all this, I think, is quite laudable. Not all of it would stand the test of at least a modern eye. Its view on sexual practices, I think many would look on a bit strangely, for example. Elsewhere, Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell." He says then on divorce, "It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her the victim of adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery." Interesting that there's not a lot there on what women are supposed to do in that situation. I guess if you're divorced and you're the lady and you didn't commit adultery, you are SOL, according to a strict interpretation, because anyone who marries you is committing adultery. It doesn't matter. The adultery stuff, however, is interesting because it's not just about external interactions with the world. This turn to say, no, even if you're lusting after someone in your mind, that counts as adultery. This has to be seen with what he's saying about giving and things like that as well. One's actions, one's morality, it all has to be quite chaste, of course, but it's all very internal. And while that seems very strict, we could put a different kind of spin on it and say, well, what he's saying about adultery, that is empowering you in a certain way. If you see that as a path to your salvation, then that is something that you yourself can control, although it's quite a level of control he's asking for. You can control it. You're reliant on no religious elite class to do it. So there we still have that kind of individual power to attain salvation going through this message. Taken in all, comments on divorce difficult to parse aside. It is essentially an egalitarian message that proved to be extremely attractive to a lot of people in the region. Local Jewish leaders feared, however, that Jesus would lead a rebellion in Palestine against Rome, and they asked very famously their local governor, Pontius Pilate, to convict Jesus for claiming to be the king of the Jews. Now, this is not a religious infraction he's made. This is a political infraction. They're saying, what if Jesus is one of these locally powerful people? What if Jesus becomes a warlord? Shouldn't you put him down? In 30 CE, Pontius, also fearing disorder caused by the rise of this new and very attractive religious sect, agrees to have Jesus crucified. And in the crucifixion, it means that Jesus preaches for a time of only about 3 years before he's killed, according to the traditional texts. Of course, Pontius Pilate sentencing Jesus to crucifixion, his death, and then in the Christian faith system, his resurrection. These are all essential. They are a sort of final human sacrifice that God requires. It initiates a cannibalistic ritual where believers have to how often depends on your particular sect of this religion, but of course you have to eat the body and drink the blood of Christ as part of a recognition of this sacrifice. But it goes back, I think, again, to what we were saying about the place of the story of Abraham and Isaac in the Hebrew Bible, there it existed to say human sacrifice is no longer part of the game, according to people who do studies on very early Hebrew traditions. Human sacrifice had been part of the game before the advent of the Hebrew Bible. Here, this is a final human sacrifice that God requires, of course, for salvation. The early Christian church relied on the establishment of small churches in Christian communities to survive. These churches would have been headed by bishops. Moving down the sort of organizational pyramid, under the bishops you would have had deacons and deaconesses. So women could be bishops in this early church, and there's evidence to suggest that this was a position of real power in deciding sort of organizational things for the very early Christian church. In this world, after the death of Jesus, the teachings of Paul become incredibly influential. Paul himself, according to tradition, was born into a wealthy family of Roman citizens in a place called Tarsus in modern-day Turkey. And Jesus is supposed to have appeared to Paul on the road to Damascus in 38 CE, so long after his death. Christian leadership never granted that Paul's vision was the same as personally knowing Jesus. So Paul kind of sticks out among early Christian leaders because he's an outsider who claims to have seen something. He's not someone who knew Jesus during his lifetime. Nonetheless, they need help. So what do? They say, Paul, welcome to the church. Now go back home to Tarsus, where he goes in 48 CE, and preach there. We don't need you here, and we don't fully trust you. Paul is famous, of course, for his letters written to an educated Greek audience in educated Greek. And what he was doing was trying to convert Jewish people who were living in the Eastern Mediterranean within this sort of Greek-speaking world. His audience, Paul's, was more prosperous than Jesus' initial audience would have been. And his letters carried Christian teaching to new churches, as did his, in-person preaching. There's some significance to his teaching. This is a system, a world in which he's living, where there is, for example, widespread slavery. He never calls for the abolition of slavery. In fact, Paul never calls at any point for any kind of social reform whatsoever. He accepted the right of the Roman Empire to exist. He very famously, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, calls for people to pay their taxes, and just, get yourself in order for Judgment Day and just make it through this world, which is evil and tainted and bad. By the time of Paul's death in 64 CE, Christianity had spread to many cities in Turkey, in Cyprus, and in Greece. Christian tradition teaches that the Apostle Peter headed the Christian church back in Rome, which would have been a very illegal thing to have been doing during his time, dying in 65. In the year 66, a Jewish uprising in Judea was met with brutality from Roman forces, and they finally destroy that Temple of Jerusalem in the year 70. Many Jews then flee the city. Afterward, Rome, Antioch, and Alexandria become major centers of the Christian church, still banned, because they were major centers of Jewish flight from Judea after the Roman attack. Let's talk then about the collapse of Rome and the integration of Christianity into its imperial system as it falls apart. So the Pax Romana ends in the 3rd century, this period where Rome is so powerful it can keep the peace everywhere. Beginning in 226, the Romans began facing enemies from the north who they called the Goths, and these Goths were winning battles near and around the sort of Danube River area. Further attacks meant that new leaders were continually experimenting with new political structures in order to defend the empire, and eventually moved the capital east. At the same time, Rome was lifting the ban on Christianity and instead giving it eventually government support. After 400, the western half of the empire was in constant economic decline, while the eastern half was actually prospering. Even as Rome fell, the region remained bound together through common languages, Latin and Greek, and a common belief in Christianity. The principate, that system that Augustus had initiated, ended during the reign of Diocletian, whose years are 284 to 305, his reign. After a significant defeat by an empire in what will become Iran, an empire called the Sassanians, Diocletian divided the Roman Empire into western and eastern halves. And to rule it, he created what's called the tetrarchy. Hard word to say, tetrarchy. A system of 4 emperors, senior and junior emperors. Constantine, then, is born into this system. He's a son of one of the junior emperors. And when he comes to power, he goes on the warpath. He defeats all of his co-rulers in this 4 emperor system until he is the sole ruler of a, once again, united Roman Empire. So he does away with the 2 halves. He brings everything under his control. In 330, he creates his new capital closer to the threatened borders of the empire in the more prosperous eastern side, threatened by not by the Goths, but by the Sassanians, at a city called Byzantium, or in Greek, Constantinople. And it's a small place. Byzantium has a population of about 50,000 people when the capital is moved there, compared to Rome, which at this point had a population of about 1 million. This is a major reform on Constantine's part, but he dies in 337 CE, leaving the empire to his 3 sons. They fought among themselves for power until the last son died in 364. No ruler afterwards was able to keep the empire together until in 395, the emperor formally divided the empire once more into its western and to its eastern halves. So Constantine's unification, undoing a splitting that Diocletian put in place, is undone itself in 395. The last major attack against Christian believers under the Roman Empire occurred under the rule of Diocletian in 303 CE. And it was Diocletian, he orders the destruction of all texts, the destruction of all churches, and harsh punishments for anyone caught practicing Christian beliefs. For him, the Christians were a threat because they just simply rejected too much of what was Roman culture. They couldn't be assimilated. They refused to worship Roman gods. They refused to worship deceased emperors. This is a direct affront to Roman cultural political authority. When Constantine comes to power in 311, he says he's done so on a vision. He says that he had this vision where he saw the sun god Apollo and the Roman numeral for 30, XXX, and that this was Apollo telling him that he was going to rule for 30 years. Sometime after this vision, however, Constantine converts to Christianity, and after his death, his Christian biographer sets the record straight and says, no, there was no vision of Apollo. What happened is Constantine saw the 3 crosses and he was just looking at them from an angle. So it turns out he was Christian the whole time, and he's a great Christian ruler. And in fairness, he does a lot to save Christianity here. It's Constantine himself who ends the persecution of Christians in 313 with what's called the Edict of Milan. In 325, Constantine even went as far as to summon church leaders to a place called Nicaea and form a council that made a basic statement of faith, the Nicene Creed, in which these leaders agreed upon, broad interpretations of the text, initiating what would be, in a broader historical trajectory, a series of meetings in subsequent years to really nail down what is Christianity and how is it practiced. In 380, Theodius I issued the Edict of Thessalonica, making Christianity not just legal within the Roman Empire, but official state religion. By the 300s, North Africa was a major center for Christianity in the world. Egyptians are the first to found monasteries, and one of the most important centers within this world was in a place called Axum, modern-day Ethiopia. Rulers here converted soon after the Nicene Creed and taxed trade from Egypt into India to begin funding not just their kingdom, but funding churches and things like that. Christianity in the African and Arab worlds spread first among merchants. They're the ones moving place to place, so they become a sort of vehicle. And the Axum church in Ethiopia looked to the Egyptian church for guidance as a model. So really, It's Egypt that is sort of the location for early Christianity, but we need to be careful here. It's easy to say, well, Egyptians are the first people to really, in a vigorous way, adopt organized Christianity and things like that, but we're not in a world where the upper crust of Egypt, the educated classes, are Egyptian, again, in the sense that you're thinking Egyptian. Remember Ptolemy, the Ptolemies of Ptolemy, right? He is Alexander's kid, so he's Macedonian, he's Greek. The upper crust of Egypt are Roman rulers, and they speak Latin and they speak Greek, and that's who they culturally are, and some of them may be from the land that we now know as the nation state of Egypt, but certainly not all of them. So to say that it's natively Egyptian is wrong. To take Egypt out of it completely is wrong. But just don't go thinking that early Christianity is a fundamentally North African thing. The people who begin to adopt it after the Nicene Creed are as Roman or as Greek as they are Egyptian, if that makes any sense. Now, Egypt is majorly important. Ethiopia, or what will become Ethiopia, has become majorly important. Early Christian sites of real significance continue to spread across what is North Africa. A little to the west, you have Hippo, now Annaba, Algeria. This becomes home to Constantine, an important Christian thinker, a very early important Christian thinker, and one of the first to emphasize sexual activity as sinful, not without basis, as we've seen from the words of Christ himself. Augustine becomes celibate after his conversion, and he eventually, much later as we'll see in this class, his emphasis on sexual activity, his inability to square the idea that God made our bodies, and our bodies tell us that sex feels good, and yet sex is bad, that kind of problem, which leads him to say, well, I'm not going to do any of it, I'm going celibate. That becomes a major link in the argument much later, but still in our course, for priests within the Catholic Church to take a vow of celibacy themselves, issued out of the Roman Church in 1100. The Eastern Roman Empire, headquartered at Constantinople, or Byzantium, is going to go on for quite a long time as the Byzantine Empire, but the western portion of that empire needs to fall. Who takes it? During the 400s, Germanic-speaking peoples, variously called Vandals, Visigoths, Ostrogoths, all kinds of Goths from every direction, were living north and west of the Western Roman Empire. So we're talking about Europe, of course, Germanic-speaking peoples. They had, of their own, no writing system, yet they were able to defeat an overstretched Roman army pretty easily. There's actually no major invasion, no evidence of a major invasion from totally alien outsiders, despite the fact that Romans like to pretend that they were this unseen force that came from nowhere. What had been going on is Germanic peoples had been living in contact with Rome for years and years. Don't forget the Roman Empire extends all the way up into the British Isles, right? Some of the groups recorded by the Romans, the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, etc., these may have been groups with leaders that interacted very closely with the Romans, but the rest of these Germanic people, they were incredibly diverse, and they were involved in a long-term migration across northern and western Europe, so leaving no real long-term archaeological footprint. They were highly mobile. They didn't have cities. But nomads are always the enemy of a settled agricultural empire. The Visigoths eventually in 410 sack Rome, and this is the first time Rome has been successfully taken and defeated since the 300s BCE, something like 700 or so years. There's no precedent for it. Now, despite the Roman insistence that the Goths are somehow simultaneously barbarian, yet well thought out enough to defeat them, weak but strong enough to put up a fight, stupid but intelligent, all these kinds of contradictory things. Despite that, they are a very serious force. And the Vandals, for example, in 430, they lead a force of 80,000 against Hippo, where Augustine is from, and they absolutely destroyed. In fact, Augustine gives us an account where he says, whole cities sacked, country villas razed, their owners killed or scattered as refugees, the churches deprived of their bishops and clergy, and the holy virgins and ascetics dispersed, some tortured to death, some killed outright, others as prisoners reduced to losing their integrity in soul and body to serve an evil and brutal enemy. Augustine really thought that this was not just the end of the Roman Empire, but the end of Christian civilization altogether. And the Vandals score a big win toward that end. Invaders continued on throughout North Africa. They moved into the islands. They took Sardinia, Corsica, and Sicily. By 455, they moved north and sacked Rome for 2 weeks. Once they've got control, there's 20 years of puppet emperors set up by Germanic peoples until in 476, the last emperor of the Western Empire was deposed and finally not replaced. The Germanic peoples no longer needed this fiction of Rome. The Eastern Empire, however, continued as the Eastern Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire for another 1,000 years, and will be, of course, the subject of further lectures. But there you have it, what at least I think you need to know, a quick, dirty history of the rise and fall of Rome, or at least the fall of its western half, and the emergence and integration of Christianity within that history. The big takeaway, however, in a world history course where Rome is one module out of 14, remember the warlords. Remember the warlords as a problem that empires have to deal with, that they have to put down. Remember the struggle to centralize power, and you will remember the one important takeaway from this lecture. That's it. See you next time.